that has held back Africans in this country, Black people in this country, and throughout the world. This anti-Blackness, as I said, is a worldwide phenomenon where people were stolen from the African continent, millions of people, at a time when millions of people was a significant portion of the population. And their natural resources were stolen. And then now we say, well, what's wrong with Africa? Why does it have so many problems? Why is it so poor? Well, it's poor because we are all rich from stealing from them. That's why it's poor. So let's begin at the beginning, which is with the beginning of the slave trade and the doctrine of discovery, which really led to this idea of manifest destiny. So the doctrine of discovery is a church-ordained doctrine, right? And this is a book from the 1800s called Slavery Ordained of God. And, there were papal bulls, so messages from the Pope, that reinforced this idea of the doctrine of discovery. And what the doctrine of discovery was a tool to open the door to the brutality of colonialism. Basically, what it said is that any European who goes to another part of the world, any Christian European who goes to another part of the world and finds land and finds resources, that those resources they can claim as their own, even if other people are living there, as long as the people who are living there are not European Christians. Right, so why did people feel like we could come to America and take the land of the Native Americans? Because God told us that we could, at least according to the church. But it went further than that. The next step of it was these people who are non-white Christians are barbarians, are even less than human. So out of our mercy towards them, we should enslave them and indoctrinate them with Christianity. That it is our responsibility as good Christians to do that. So how can a slave owner whip a slave almost to death and then go to church afterwards? Because slavery was ordained of God. So we have to be very clear about the extent to which this is part of our society. This was not a fringe movement. This was the center of society. This was the center of the belief system. So if we look at slavery in the British colonies, and I'm going to go through this very quickly because I think we're starting to run short on time. I'll be maybe another 10 or 15 minutes, hopefully. A few things that I want to point out here is that in the legalized colonies in 1619, shortly after the colonies were founded, indentured servitude, which is basically another form of slavery, was legalized. But these were basically white slaves. During that period of time, from 1619 to 1662, Africans enjoyed the same status, at least in the British. So in the Spanish colonies, they were all slaves. But in the British colonies, they enjoyed the same status as the English colonists, meaning they could be slaves, they could be indentured servants, or they could be, free people. But then over the next 30 years, the rights of the Africans were slowly curtailed, leading to declarations in Virginia and Maryland being the first two states that in perpetuity, any person of African descent was a slave, regardless of what their status was. So if you were free, you became a slave. And in perpetuity means that your children were also born slaves. And if we look at what caused this to happen, well, certainly there were some economic issues behind it, but it was really a fear because there were several uprisings that occurred where the poor Black people and the poor white people fought together against the English autocracy. Right, these were called the frontier uprisings. You may have heard of like Bacon's uprising and so on and so forth. And there were, each one of them had its own issue, but what they were seeing over and over again is that the poor whites and the poor blacks were banding together to fight against the wealthy. And so what they did was they got rid of indentured servitude, they freed the poor whites, and they said that all black people will be slaves. This was done in part to maintain the free labor that they needed for their economic progress. But the bigger reason behind it was to stop the common people from being able to band together. They created a caste system, elevating the poor white people above black people. And we see today in our society that this continues. So, and then we hopefully all know the rest of the history with the cotton gin, the need for slaves and slavery greatly expanded and grew. We have the Dred Scott case where the Supreme Court declared that blacks could not be considered citizens of the US and had no rights that a white man was required to respect. So this is after the Bob declared his mission that this case occurred. We had the Civil War in the United States. We had in 1865 the 13th Amendment ratified, which of note was not ratified in Mississippi until 1995. So the state of Mississippi did not ratify the 13th Amendment until 1995. Think about that. That's not something that we're taught in our history books. And so we had, this era of slavery and of dehumanization of Africans. But what's covered up even more than that is what's happened post-slavery. The Jim Crow laws, the redlining, the gerrymandering, the GI Bill, the destruction of black communities, the counterintelligence programs where the FBI basically treated black power organizations the same way that they treat, and they're still doing the same today, right? They treated these organizations the same way they treat an organization such as ISIS, and they infiltrated them and they killed their leaders without any type of justice system. People were just executed in their homes. And then we have the current system of holding black people back, which is the war on drugs and mass incarceration. So I'm briefly going to touch on some of these things. I know that we're running late on time, but I think it's important for us to look and understand these. At least it was for me, because it made me start to understand that, okay, there is actually this idea of equal opportunity for all is not true. There is an uneven playing field, but it's been hidden from me because I had the opportunities. I had what's called white privilege. It's those opportunities. It doesn't mean that I didn't work hard to get what I did, but it means that I had the opportunity to work hard and be successful. And there are other people in this country who are equally as intelligent as me and who may work as hard, but can have no expectation to be successful. So let's look at Norfolk, Virginia. So what you see here is redlining. So basically, what was done during the Great Depression was that banks would split up areas into what was considered high risk and low risk. And they would only give loans for home ownership into the low risk areas, not the high risk areas. Well, guess who lived in the high risk areas? The high risk areas were black areas. The low risk areas were the wealthy white areas. And then the intermediate areas were poor white areas. So this was, back at the beginning of the 1900s, right? But if we look at Norfolk, Virginia today, we see that these lines that were drawn way back then are still in effect today. So if you look at where black people live in Norfolk, Virginia, it's still in these same areas that were redlined. And if you look at the income in Norfolk, Virginia today, you see that the higher income areas are these white areas that were given, considered to be low risk and were given business and home ownership loans, whereas these other areas remain low income. So the thing about capitalism is that it's in the name. It requires capital. And if you're going to give one group of people capital, well, they can use that capital to build wealth. And if you're going to deny another group of people capital, they are at a disadvantage. And again, the number one way that wealth is passed generationally in the United States is actually through home and land ownership. So white people are automatically have a step up just because of this. If nothing else had happened, just because of this historical fact, you have a step up, right? Then there's gerrymandering. If we look at the percentage of African Americans by population share in this country, we see, again, concentration in the Southeast. But if we look at the leadership of these communities, it's not Black. If you look at Georgia, they just had their first Black senator ever elected. So how is it that you can have an area where the majority of the population is Black but not have a single Black senator? And that's the explanation for that is gerrymandering. They draw the district lines so that the votes of Black people count less. So in Jim Crow, the votes of Black people counted less because they were considered less human. After the civil rights movement, well, that wasn't allowed anymore, so they found another way to do the same exact thing. And I will say that these, as we look at the history, this is why our current society's idea of trying to change laws and change institutions, although important, is not sufficient. As the message from the Universal House of Justice says, it says that those movements will not be sufficient because racism will find another way. It will find another way to do its work. And this is an example of again, how Jim Crow has just changed another way to decrease Black votes, as is voter intimidation and other laws that make it harder for Black people to vote. So part of what began to happen was that Black people recognized that they could not be successful in white society. So they created their own communities that were financially, economically distinct from white communities. And these communities began to thrive. And there's stories of these communities all over the country, but I think the most talked about is Tulsa, which was known as the Black Wall Street. But what happened throughout the country was this. And I'm not showing you what's in the middle because it's a Black man being burned at a stake. But throughout the country, Black communities were terrorized. And we like to think that it was the Ku Klux Klan doing it, but that's not the case. Lynchings were part of American culture. These are, if you can look at the picture here, look at who's posing. These aren't Ku Klux, maybe some of them are Ku Klux Klan members, but no one's wearing a white hood. These are just people who showed up and performed a lynching, and it was just part of normal white American society, and they're very proud of it, and they're very proud to be in this picture. So this is the Greenwood district of Tulsa, Oklahoma, what was known as the Black Wall Street, right? A very thriving, actually one of the wealthiest communities in the United States. And as you can imagine, this enraged the white people in Tulsa. And so May 31st, 1921, basically for suspicion of, I think it was a Black man saying something to a white woman in an elevator, which is always the case. So it's always the case behind these lynchings, right? Police arrested 60% of the Black residents living in Black Wall Street. And basically the entire community was destroyed. Hundreds of Black citizens were murdered. And this wasn't just an unorganized mob. This was a planned attack. The National Guard was there. And in their testimonies, the National Guard referred to the Black citizens as the enemy. And the white citizens were armed by the local police and the National Guard to go in and help them drive out the Black citizens. So even when Black people were able to, despite all of the hardships against them, were able to thrive, we destroyed their communities. So this is a picture from Tulsa. You can see this white mob. You can see this Black man being arrested. This is what it looked like afterwards. This is what it looked like during. You can see this postcard that someone sent, running the Negro out of Tulsa. So these are parts of our history that we don't talk about very much, that aren't known. And we think, oh, this was, so long ago. This was not that long ago. And the effects of these things still happen today. But the important point is that these types of programs are ongoing today. So again, in the 60s and 70s, Black communities formed a strong urban center. And it was these government counterintelligence programs that were designed to go in there and destroy the leadership of those communities. And then there was the war on drugs and mass incarceration that further destroyed these communities. So Michelle Alexander in the new Jim Crow talks about this. She says, African Americans are not significantly more likely to use or sell prohibited drugs than whites, but they are made criminals at drastically higher rates for precisely the same conduct. So we have a justice system that is levied against Black people. We have a police force that's levied against Black people. It's, again, another way to hold them back. It says, in the era of colorblindness, it is no longer socially permissible to use race explicitly as a justification for discrimination. Right? So what happens is we criminalize Black people. And it says here, as a criminal, you have scarcely more rights and arguably less respect than a Black man living in Alabama at the height of Jim Crow. We have not ended racial caste in America. We have merely redesigned it. And this goes back to what the Universal House of Justice has said about this, that racism will find a way to reform itself. Every time we try to eradicate it, it will find a way to reform itself until we can eradicate it from our hearts. So why does this occur? Why go through all this trouble to hold Black people back? And I think the answer to that is complex, but probably the overarching reason is simple, and that's fear. It's fear that the Black people are going to come and take what is ours. Right? If you live in a nice gated community, what is the reason for the gates around that community? It's to stop these other people from coming in and taking what is yours. And the reason why we focus on Black people is twofold. One, historically, we have been taught, despite the evidence to the contrary, we have been taught that Black people are criminals. Being Black has been criminalized. So this is one of this is the first encyclopedia ever created, and this is from Dr. Derek Smith, who I think probably many of you know well, who is an outstanding Baha'i scholar in his essay Centering the Pupil of the Eye. And he talks about the first encyclopedia where there is an entry titled Negroes, Character of Negroes in General. And what it says is that they are always vicious, mostly inclined to lasciviousness, vengeance, theft, and lies. So to justify the way that we have treated Black people historically, we have said, well, they're criminals. They're violent people. We have to be afraid of them. They're less than human. That's how we could justify slavery, right? They're less than human. And so how do we justify our treatment of them today? That they are inclined to violence, to theft, and to lies. But ultimately, it goes down to this fear of retribution. In our hearts, we know that our society is built on injustice. And we're concerned that if we try to deal out true justice, it will mean that we have to lose what we have materially. Ultimately, racism is a disease of materialism and greed. That's what was the motivation behind it, and that's what's still the motivation behind it today. This is from Thomas Jefferson, one of our founding fathers. He says, deep-rooted prejudices entertained by the whites, 10,000 recollections by the blacks of the injuries they have sustained, new provocations, the real distinctions which nature has made will divide us into parties and produce convulsions which will probably never end, but in the extermination of the one or the other race. So if you're wondering why there's these white militias that are preparing for a race war, it's because our founding fathers told them it was going to happen. They told them that they are either going to exterminate us or we are going to exterminate them. Right? So this is why there is this fear of Black people. This is why there is this absolute fear of Black power. So looking at this, if we look at the facts, if you look at crime facts, as a white person looking at homicide, it's much, much more likely that you should be afraid of white people other than Black or African American people, just looking at the facts. But that's not who we're afraid of, right? Going back to kind of my whole thought of when I'm walking down a dark street at night, who am I afraid of? Is it a group of white people or a group of Black people? Well, it's a group of Black people. But that's not statistically correct. That's not logical, but it's what society has taught me. Oftentimes we'll say, well, if Black communities just focused more on education, they'd be able to improve their status. Well, if we look at college-educated Americans, this is the odds of becoming a millionaire, okay? Much higher for college-educated Asians and whites than college-educated Hispanics and Blacks. So education is not the issue. It's not that Black people are not wanting to educate themselves or are less educated. It's the fact that our society is levied against them. In fact, you can see that a college-educated Black family has a lower net household worth than a white family with less than a high school education that hasn't even graduated high school. So although education does make a difference, you can see that it increases, yet it makes a much bigger difference if you're white. It makes a much bigger difference for me than it does for my Black brothers and sisters, because I have opportunities where my education can lead to wealth, opportunities that aren't afforded to my Black brothers and sisters. So, I think the crux of it is this, and sorry, I'm running over. So if Liz, if you need me to stop, you can just send me a message and I'll stop at any point, because I think I still have a couple of minutes left to go. So if it's going too long, I can stop at any time. The crux of it is this, that we have a debt that we owe, whether you are a descendant of a slave owner or whether, like me, you have come here and this is your first generation here. Because we live in a society that is wealthy, and we all benefit from that. But the people who created that wealth have not been allowed to benefit from that. So this is from Edward Baptiste in a book called The Half Has Not Been Told. He says, the idea that the commodification and suffering and forced labor of African Americans is what made the United States powerful and rich is not an idea that people necessarily are happy to hear, yet it is the truth. So my nice house, my car, all of these things, the thing that allows me access to this kind of wealth is the blood of Black people. It is their labor that made this country wealthy. If you look at American economics and the history of American economics, how did we go from being colonies to becoming the largest trading partners with all the European powers to becoming the largest economy in the world? Well, we did it because the top commodities at that time, things like tobacco, cotton, sugarcane, we were able to outcompete the rest of the market because we had free labor producing those things for us. Yet the people who produce those commodities, as I've shown you here, have not been allowed the opportunity to benefit from the wealth that they have created. Yet the rest of us do have that opportunity. So it's not just the Baha'i issue of we have a spiritual mandate to do this, but every American benefits from the work that slaves did. So what if we aren't able to do this as a Baha'i community? What if we're not able to really focus and to work on this and to do the hard work that's required? This is from Abdul Baha, also published in the Star of the West. He says, utmost sorrow and sadness was produced owing to the prejudices and enmity which exist between the white and colored races. So the biggest consequence in my mind is that we are going to cause sorrow and sadness for Abdul Baha. But he goes on to say, discord and bloodshed will be increased day by day, and the foundation of the prosperity of the world of man will be destroyed. Those are not words to be taken lightly. The foundation of the prosperity of the world of man, the entire world, will be destroyed. Also in the Star of the West, there is a greater danger than only the shedding of blood. It is the destruction of America. I think the events of the past week, although maybe 10 or 20 years ago, we may not have really understood those statements. I think the events of the past week are showing us how accurate Abdul Baha and Shoghi Effendi were. So we have a really important task in front of us, and it is linked to the destiny of America and our destiny as American Baha'is. Abdul Baha tells us that the continent of America is in the eyes of the one true God, the land wherein the splendors of his light shall be revealed, where the mysteries of his faith shall be unveiled. So when we take that in the context of us being told that our most vital and challenging issue is racism, it makes it clear that this is the bed of anti-Blackness and of racism. And we have to deal with it here, not just to save America, but to save the whole world. That if we are able to overcome it here, the rest of the world will be able to follow our example. But if we tear ourselves apart here, then the rest of the world will tear themselves apart too. Abdul Baha says, when the racial elements of the American nation unite in actual fellowship and accord, the lights of the oneness of humanity will shine. This is the sign of the most great peace. That the work that we are doing here in this country in building actual fellowship and accord is the work that needs to be done to establish the most great peace. Shoghi Effendi calls us the invincible army of Baha'u'llah, who in the West And at one of its potential storm centers is to fight in his name and for his sake one of its fiercest and most glorious battles. This is the battle that we're fighting right now, I believe, that Shoghi Effendi is referring to. He says, the community of the organized promoters of the faith of Baha'u'llah in the American continent, the spiritual descendants of the dawnbreakers of a heroic age, who by their death proclaimed the birth of that faith, must in turn usher in, not by their death, but through living sacrifice, that promised world order, the shell ordained to enshrine that priceless jewel, the world civilization of which the faith itself is the sole begetter. Through living sacrifice is what we're called to do. In some ways, living sacrifice is harder than martyrdom. And what I mean by that, obviously the martyrs have made the ultimate sacrifice, but what I mean by that is that when you are martyred, you make that decision once. We have to wake up every morning and make the commitment to be martyred. We have to wake up every morning and say, I'm going to put my own feelings, my own prejudices, the way that the way that's comfortable for me to view the world, I'm going to put all of these things aside. Every day we have to wake up and do that because we're swimming in a stream that is pushing us very strongly in a given direction. And if we're not actively swimming against that, if we're not doing this living sacrifice, we're going to be carried away by that tide the way that the rest of American society is, because the forces allied against us are very, very strong. So I think, a lot of our society talks about the sins of commission, right? So the things that you're not supposed to do, the sins you're not supposed to do. But as Baha'is, we're held to a higher standard. It's not good enough just to not do the things you're not supposed to do. There's also the sins of omission, which in many ways are the bigger sins. That means not doing the things you're supposed to do, right? So it's not good enough to say, oh, well, I'm a good person, I don't hurt anyone else, which is what our society says. We have to actively be working to build the kingdom of God. Again, Peggy McIntosh says, the remedy is not just accepting or tolerating people who are different from us. Being a nice person will not dismantle institutional systems of bias and privilege. We live in a very unique time when the major and minor plans, as outlined in the Advent of Divine Justice, are on a collision course. And, I really think that part of what our job is to do, and really the main thrust of what we're supposed to do, is to build a new society, build an example. This is what the whole community building that we're talking about, the core activities, it's about building the foundations for a new society, because this old society is failing. But if we are bringing in to this new society that we are building the same errors and the same weaknesses of the old society, then the foundation is not going to be strong enough. So what can we do? In the Advent of Divine Justice, Shoghi Effendi tells us, let the white make a supreme effort, a supreme effort. I can tell you that I haven't made a supreme effort. I'm working on it, but I can't say that the work that I've done constitutes a supreme effort. So that's something that I have to examine every day. It says to abandon their usually inherent and at times subconscious sense of superiority, to contribute their share to the solution of this problem. He says to persuade them through their intimate, spontaneous, and informal association. So what does that mean? If you go to feast and you wave at a Black person, is that unity? That's not what Shoghi Effendi is talking about. Intimate, spontaneous, and informal association. That's friendship. So take a look at who comes over to your house for dinner. Take a look at who comes to your kids' birthday parties. Take a look at who you call when you're in need and who calls you when they're in need. Those are your friends. And what do they look like? Is it all people that look like you? Or does it really reflect the diversity of the human family, as it's supposed to in the Baha'i faith? This part is also important, to master their impatience of any lack of responsiveness on the part of the people who have received for so long a period such grievous and slow healing wounds. And let's be clear, these grievous and slow healing wounds have been inflicted by society as a whole, but have also been inflicted within the Baha'i communities. And in some ways, it's even worse when it's inflicted in the Baha'i communities, because this is supposed to be a safe space. This is supposed to be communities where Black people can come in and let their guard down. And when they let their guard down and we wound them the same way that the wider American society wounds them, it hurts even more. So we shouldn't be impatient. We shouldn't be surprised that, oh, well, you know, I tried and people didn't seem to really respond to the one effort that I've made. No, we have to show those efforts through daily vigilance, as Shoghi Effendi tells us, through living sacrifice. And only over time will our Black brothers and sisters become responsive to that. And everyone's at different stages. We're all at different stages, and our Black brothers and sisters are at different stages. There's no one answer. There's no one homogenous response, right? But what Shoghi Effendi does tell us, and you know, this goes back to the, well, why does everything have to be about race? He says it should be consistently demonstrated in every phase of their activity in life, whether in the Baha'i community or outside it, in public or in private, formally as well as informally. It should be deliberately cultivated. Right? So that's why. Because Shoghi Effendi tells us that in everything that we do, it should be about race. In every phase, that it should be deliberately cultivated. And the Universal House of Justice says the same thing. He says that they say that the core activities are a tool that we can use to help address racial injustice. It's not an activity that's outside of that. It's actually a tool that we've been given to do that. Shoghi Effendi in The Advent of Divine Justice goes on to tell us that it requires ceaseless exertions, sacrifices, care and vigilance, moral courage, and fortitude. It says, on the distance they cover and the manner in which they travel that road must depend to an extent which few among them can imagine, the operation of those intangible influences which are indispensable to the spiritual triumph of the American believers. Again, this goes back to that previous quote from Sadie Oglesby, where Shoghi Effendi tells us that the faith will not grow until this issue has been dealt with. And we can see that in America, the Baha'i faith is not growing. It's growing all around the world, but in America, it is not. And I think if we want to understand the reason why, Shoghi Effendi has already told us why. So this is from the Universal House of Justice. So, you know, these are all, I've highlighted words in here, and I'll share this, but, you know, we have to think about, these are the things that I think about myself. Have I made ceaseless exertions? Have I sacrificed? Have I had moral courage and fortitude? But the Universal House of Justice tells us that it requires a profound alteration of thought and action. This is in their recent letter in regards to racism and racial injustice in the United States. One of the first letters they've written in a long time that's been addressed to the American Baha'i community. Right? A profound alteration of thought and action. So if we think that by doing the things we've done before, by thinking the way that we've been thinking, that that's going to solve the problem, it's not. We need to change ourselves. We need to change our communities. So this is what I'm working on. This is my personal action plan. And what I suggest is for everybody to create a personal action plan. And everyone's action plan is going to look different. But for me, it's helpful to have something written down that I can refer to and say, okay, how am I doing? in trying to achieve these things. And I'm going to walk through some of these things. So one is to educate myself and to reflect on my own racism. And there's a list of resources that I'll share with you that I'm using to do this, but certainly there's innumerable resources you can choose. The second thing is to educate those around me, to educate my family, to educate my coworkers, to educate my fellow Baha'is. And that's, part of why I'm here doing this today. The next is to take actions within the context of the 5-year plan. The next is to not be colorblind. And what I mean by this is again, this idea of not seeing color, that's not the solution. We need to see color, we need to appreciate color, and we need to work based on color to create justice and unity. And this can mean a lot of different things, right? I'll tell you one example, a recent example of my color blindness was not this past Thanksgiving, but the Thanksgiving before that. I had a Black friend who was coming into town because his family lived here in Sacramento to visit them for Thanksgiving. And they had like a big Thanksgiving reunion. And so the house was full. So I said, you're welcome to stay at my house. My family's actually gone down to Southern California for Thanksgiving. I'm on call at the beginning of the week, but then I'm going to leave at the second half of the week. So you can stay with me and then have the house to yourself for the second half of the week. And so when he got here, he said, yeah, I'll stay here while you're here, but then when you're gone, I'm going to leave too. And I said, why? The other house is crowded. You have my whole, house to yourself. And he said, I don't feel safe here. And to me, that was shocking, right? Because I live in a wealthy white neighborhood, a safe neighborhood. But that's the key. What is safe for me is not safe for a Black person. He didn't feel comfortable being in my neighborhood without me. So we need to think about this when we plan our Baha'i activities. We tend to plan our Baha'i activities in the neighborhoods that Persian and white people feel comfortable in, because we don't feel comfortable going into the Black neighborhoods, without ever considering that, well, the Black people don't feel comfortable coming into our neighborhoods. And when you look statistically, they're right and we're wrong as far as how legitimate is that fear. Right? White on Black violence far exceeds Black on white violence. So these are some of the tools that I'm using for my self-education on racism. And again, we'll share this document so that you all can look at that. And these are just what I'm using. I recommend them to you, but you also can, please don't stop with these, or feel free to adjust it however you want. To go through the rest of these relatively quickly, listening, hearing the voice of my Black brothers and sisters. And again, that goes back to what I was saying at the beginning here. I'm not the one that should be here having this conversation. But the reason why I'm the one having this conversation is because we haven't, over the past decades, listened to our Black brothers and sisters when they've tried to have this conversation with us. We've negated their experiences. And so we need to stop doing that. Even though it hurts us to hear what they have to say, we have to accept that hurt, because unity and healing this issue is going to be difficult, and it's going to be hurtful, and it's going to be uncomfortable. But we have to be willing to do that work. This is the work that we've been called on to do. To increase social interactions. It's been repeatedly shown in scientific studies that the best way to overcome societal biases is through friendship. So if society is telling me that Black people are criminals, I can read the facts and say, okay, well, no, that's not true. But that still doesn't change what's in my heart and in my mind. That still doesn't change that bias. What changes that bias is actually my personal experiences with Black people, where I see, oh no, they're not criminals. Right? But that doesn't happen if we don't expand our bubbles. That doesn't happen if we are not deliberately talking about race. But this goes back to kind of what I was saying, who are your friends, not the people who you go to feast with, but who's coming over to your house for dinner? Who are the people that you're interacting with on a daily basis? Until you expand that circle, those aren't really those informal, those spontaneous relationships that Shoghi Effendi is talking about. The next is to be patient, to honor Blackness. And I'm going to talk about this a little bit too, because our society talks a lot about tolerance, but that's not the Baha'i point of view. The Baha'i point of view is that Blackness is to be honored, right? That every group of people on this planet bring a very unique perspective and unique skills, and all of these skills are required for the building of a new world. To create communities that protect people of color, Baha'i communities that protect people of color, and to address injustice in my workplace. So going back to that honoring Black people, I want to just very briefly talk about this. So Abdul Baha, as we all know, refers to Black people as the pupil of the eye, right? He's talking about humanity as a whole body, and Black people are the pupil of the eye. Again, without the pupil of the eye, we can't see. We can't see where we're going. So we need the leadership of Black people within our Baha'i communities. Shoghi Effendi tells us that the horrible taint of discrimination and contempt should be supplanted by a feeling of esteem for their great gifts. Esteem for their great gifts. That the qualities of heart so richly possessed by the Negro are much needed in the world today. Their great capacity for faith, their loyalty and devotion to their religion. God has richly endowed them, and their contribution to the cause is much needed. We need our Black brothers and sisters. We need them to be active parts of our community. We cannot succeed without them. And this goes back to Esfandiar, but as I mentioned earlier, I don't think it's a mistake that the closest confidant of Baha'u'llah and the closest confidant of the Bab were Black. Even though we don't talk about it a lot as Baha'is, the example was set for us from the very beginning. Abdul Baha says that Esfandiar was the faithful servant of Baha'u'llah who was entrusted with his secrets. He says, if a perfect man could be found in this world, that man was Esfandiar. So I'll end with this quote, because I think what we're being called to do is difficult and painful, and it's easier to run from this fight. There's no question about it. And there's plenty of room to run to if you're white. If you're white, there's plenty of room to run to where you can be ignorant about this work and what needs to happen. Yet, we are told that we live in the most special time in the history of humanity, and that none of us are here by accident. Each soul was handpicked to be alive at this time because we have the unique capacity to do the work that needs to be done right now. So I'll leave you with this quote. The word of God has set the heart of the world afire. How regrettable if ye fail to be enkindled with its flame. Let your principal concern be to rescue the fallen from the slough of impending extinction, and to help him embrace the ancient faith of God. For ye are the first among men to be recreated by his Spirit, the first to adore and bow the knee before him, the first to circle round his throne of glory. I swear by him who hath caused me to reveal whatever hath pleased him. Ye are better known to the inmates of the kingdom on high than ye are known to your own selves. Think ye these words to be vain and empty? Would that ye had the power to perceive the things your Lord, the all-merciful, doth see. things that attest the excellence of your rank, that bear witness to the greatness of your worth, that proclaim the sublimity of your station. So I will stop there, and I thank you all for your attention, and I apologize that I went significantly over time, but sometimes when I get talking about this, I could just go on forever. So I apologize for that, but hopefully we have time for some discussion still and questions. So thank you again, everyone, for your attention.
Thank you so much, Dr. Arta. Would you mind, there we go. Perfect. So I don't know if you all saw in the chat, I opened the chat up if you want to make any comments in the chat. And if you do have questions, however, please raise your hand and I will call on you. I know Quanta had her hand up. And before I call on you, I just want, if we could just give our hand to Dr. Arta, you know her. Thank you so much for your time. This was such an enlightening conversation. And I just wanted to add the opportunity map that you shared with us, where there were different maps. I did a project actually for Greensboro where I was opportunity mapping and kind of overlapping the maps. And I just wanted to mention for friends, you know, it's a tool online. And what's fascinating is you can also pull up where the hospitals are. And you'll note that the hospitals also often fall in white neighborhoods or right on the lines of the opportunity maps between white and Black neighborhoods. You'll notice you can also pull up grocery stores. So you'll also see a lot of the line grocery stores in Black neighborhoods. You'll see Harris Teeters in the white neighborhoods. You'll see a lot of dollar stores in the Black neighborhood. So there's all sorts of stuff that you can map and you can see how different neighborhoods are targeted. And so even thinking about food deserts and where the food ends up is definitely based on these opportunity maps that have been gerrymandered from, you know, decades ago. And so just something to think about as we jump into the conversation. Quanta, we'll start with Quanta.
Thank you. Aloha pa, everybody.
Aloha.
I really thank you very much for this wonderful presentation. And I did listen to it actually a couple of weeks or maybe last week and posted to the Baha'is of Facebook. One thing that I really am concerned with is that our focus disregarding the fact that we have an economic class of people, both white and Black, and the Black poverty in the urban areas, and then the white poverty in the rural areas. We Baha'is have to come together, somehow address both. So if we are truly thinking about bringing unity, racial unity, when we use the word racist and automatically addressing the person who is white, are we then inadvertently, maybe subconsciously, bringing more dividing lines while taking care of the wounded, but we also have to somehow, those who are also wounded, but then thinking that they are still better and wounding others, we have to find a way to bring both sides together, I think. Think of it, you know, like I posted in there from the Hidden Words, you know, the Midnight of the Rich. Doctor, you have mentioned how your friend felt uncomfortable in your rich neighborhood. Perhaps you can start there and teach them about racism so that your community will be a place where your African-American friend will be feeling safe and comfortable. Thank you.
Yeah. Sure. Yeah, I'll kind of address. I think a few things were brought up. So the first is I agree completely. I don't think, I think our society right now is in a mode of name calling, and I don't agree with that at all. I don't think that name calling does anything other than break down than kind of put up barriers to communication. At the same time, I think we also need to be truthful, right? So I don't think that, saying that our society is a racist society is anything but the truth. And there are people who will be offended by that statement. But I think that we have to be truthful about, where we live and what's happening in the world around us. So I would never call an individual a racist other than myself, because I don't know what's in anyone else's heart. But I can tell you that I am racist based on the definition of racism, right? I think it's very difficult to live in American society and not be racist. I will also say that because we live in a society where every day the media, the culture, everything about our society is feeding our brain information that biases us against Black and Native Americans. So we live in a racist society. But I agree, there's a lot of these, platforms where people are calling each other names and things like that. And I don't think that does anything other than put up barriers to discussion. So I agree with that. And I apologize if anyone thought that that's what I was doing. When I'm using the term racist, I'm referring to our society in general or to myself. And then I think in regards to your second question, educating my neighbors is something that I have been working on. But to be honest with you, it's not just about my neighbors. It's about, I live in a neighborhood where a Black person walking down the street is seen to not belong there and is considered a threat, right? And is much more likely to get harassed by the police than a white person walking down the street, even though they may be doing nothing different, right? So I think that's the truth of where I live, and I hadn't considered that. We have Baha'i activities at our house all the time, and I hadn't considered that, well, maybe there's people who feel unwelcome coming here. Maybe there's people who don't feel safe coming here. And so it's just one of those aha moments that I had, that I would have never really thought about.
Thank you. Any other questions? I can't see everybody's hands up. If you are raising your hand and not using the little blue/white hand. I did want to mention, as we wait for questions, there's a really great article, just to piggyback on Kwanta's question, that's called "What About Poor White People?" and it's by Ricky Allen. And I highly recommend it if you're interested in reading about this idea that is often used, that thinking about poor white people in a different way, and it kind of reinforces this idea that we've all bought into this structural and systemic system, and even poor white people have as well, right? Even though they have to work hard, we all have to work hard. And so it's just a really great article, just to piggyback on that.
Yeah, I think, if we look at the interests of poor white people, they are very closely aligned with the interests of African Americans. Yet the biggest divide generally is between poor white people and African Americans, right? And this comes down to the caste system that has been developed, and it's purely economics. Because if the poor and the disenfranchised stand together and demand justice, then those who are the most privileged are the ones who stand to lose. So I think there is a very clear intentional divide to make the poor white people feel that the reason why you're poor is not because of the wealthy. It's not because we live in a society where, you know, Jeff Bezos can make, you know, 1,000,000 times more money than one of his employees. And I believe I believe in capitalism, and that someone who starts a company should make more, and people who work harder should make more. But is he working 1,000,000 times harder than the people who are out there risking their lives delivering his packages? Is that economic justice? No, right? But what we are taught in this country is that, oh, well, whatever you can make by any means is fair. If you can make it, if the market can bear it, then that's fair, right? And so then what we teach the poor white people is that, well, the reason why you're poor is not because of this injustice, because this injustice is America. This is the American way. The reason why you're poor is because Black people have taken opportunities from you, right? Because immigrants, Mexicans are coming in and they're taking your work.
Thank you. Any other questions? As we wait for questions, I also wanted to add.
I thought I saw Yvonne maybe physically raising her hand, although I'm not certain about that. Maybe not.
No, I was not.
Oh, okay, sorry about that.
I have a question, but because you can't see my face, I wasn't able to put my hand up. I'm Bendu. Can I please ask a question?
Yes.
I'm interested in everything you said, but something that hit me was this idea of cognitive dissonance. And the cognitive dissonance, I feel that can get to the bottom, the root of the problem to eradicate racism, is the cognitive dissonance between our nobility as a human family and how we act based on this nobility. And I'd like you to please talk about that, because I've discovered through experience, like you said, through experience and knowledge, we get understanding, that this is the crux of the problem. When Baha'u'llah says we're all noble, this has got to play in how we dismantle racism. And I'll get myself off.
Yeah, I think that's in my own life and my own experiences, I think that I wholeheartedly agree with that. You know, racism is ultimately a disease of materialism, right? It's powered by greed. And so when we talk about, well, racism is based on fear and ignorance, that's true, but what is the source of that fear? The source of that fear is materialism and greed, right? It's this idea that this other group is going to take what I have. This other group is going to gain power and create a society where I can no longer be privileged and have the benefits of material wealth, right? But greed and material wealth are really what counteracts, where you know, this is one of the basic teachings of the Baha'i faith, is that our nobility is our spiritual nobility. And so in truth, the reason why we have a spiritual mandate to deal with racism is because the solution, as you're pointing out, is a spiritual solution. There certainly are going to be tangible societal, economic changes that need to be made, but the ultimate solution is a spiritual one, recognizing our nobility, recognizing that we're all made by one God, and overcoming the materialism that leads to racism. And what's scary for me is that when you look at the entire world has followed America's lead. You know, Shoghi Effendi tells us that there's a very unique and dangerous form of materialism that was created in Europe, but perfected in the United States. And the rest of the world has bought into that materialism. And so that is what we have to fight against. And that is where, you know, I think this issue of our true nobility comes into play. Because if all we are is what we own, then to be honest, racism makes sense. It makes sense to hold down another group and get more for yourself, if that's what brings you nobility. So it is this idea of spiritual nobility, of being made in the image of God, that we're all made by the one God. I think that ultimately is the tool that fights racism, but that's not to say that all these other things, that we can only focus on that, right? It's complex and interlaced problem.
Thank you. We'll have Hoda. Hi. Well, that will be the last question, and then we will have to stop for today since it's already getting late.
Thank you so much, Liz, for starting this platform. And I really, really want to thank you, Arta, from the bottom of my heart for your straightforwardness, for your truth, your honesty, and your great study. And because you're right at the tip of the arrow in explaining these very complex, truthful, but extremely powerful, that has kept America too, one white, one black, and we as immigrant Iranians that come over here, we're taught to drink the Kool-Aid of white supremacy and hold it up. I want to ask you, how does this conversation go for you in spaces where you have interaction with other Iranian Baha'is? How is that taken? Help me, because I'm going to hopefully post your talk on my Facebook group, and I know there's going to be backlash, but often the backlash is by silence. That's the weapon that is used. I'm not going to go there. It's not my problem. This is too much. It's creating disunity. But help me from your personal experience that you clearly put out there. What is your experience in dealing with the backlash on speaking this truth?
So I think it depends on who it is that I'm talking to. So to be frank with you, the younger Iranian generation has done a much better job than the older Iranian generation. And this is not surprising. Baha'u'llah tells us that we are to carry forward an ever advancing civilization. And this is part of the advance. Each generation is going to be better than the generation before it. So I think that the younger generation is, and again, this is a generalization, right? There's always, individuals on both ends of the spectrum, but the younger generation more so, I think, is open to and has done some of their own study. And I think part of this is also aligned with the societal changes. So what I worry about with the younger generation is that they are adopting the solutions of general society for racism, which we're also told as Baha'is are not the correct solutions in and of themselves. They can certainly be part of the solution, but they're not the correct solutions in and of themselves, because just changing institutions is not going to change racism. It will find another way to manifest itself. With the older generation, I think, to be honest with you, for the most part, the response has been positive. But at the same time, I have to say that it may be a self-selected group of people who I interact with, right? So the people who show up to a meeting like this to talk about race are people who already have some interest in it, right? And so perhaps the Persian Baha'is who don't feel that it's an issue or who don't feel that it's their issue are not going to be here in the first place to kind of to listen to what needs to be said. And so I try to reach those people through, my own personal interactions with them, through my own interactions with my family. I can tell you that I talk about this all the time with my own family, with my parents in particular. A lot of my family supported Trump. And we're not supposed to be political, and I don't want to be political, but what I will say is that the reason behind that was a fear of Muslims, right? And they had this experience in Iran where they saw what Muslim fanaticism could do. And so that fear of Muslims that was being preached resonated with them, right? But they didn't understand all of the other contexts of the racism that was going on, right? And so what I tried to do was educate them, because they felt a lot of, and educate myself, because they felt a lot of the things that I've described, they also felt. well, we came here with nothing. We've worked hard. We've been successful. So why are Black people complaining? Why does everything have to be about race? Because, even less so than me, they don't have access to that truth unless they go and search for it, right? So the truth that they're given is the truth that they're given by the media, the truth that they're given by society in general, and that's the truth that is there is that truth. So that's where, again, that independent investigation of truth for all of us, regardless of age, regardless of background, is so critical. And since this was the last question, I'll just apologize again for taking so long. I didn't mean to run as far over, and I was hoping we could have more time for discussion. But I'll have Liz share my email address in the presentation, and I'm always happy to continue the discussion offline.
Thank you so much for your presentation.